Welcome to Strategic Affairs. In the heart of London, where cobblestone streets wind through centuries of history, a silent mystery began to unfold. It was not about ancient kings or hidden treasures, but about a modern project that promised to change the face of one of the city's most historic sites. The Royal Mint, once the beating heart of Britain's currency and a fortress of financial power, suddenly found itself at the center of an international storm. The mystery, a plan by China to build its largest embassy in the world on this hallowed ground. At first glance, it seemed like a simple story of development, an old site, no longer used for its original purpose, waiting to be given new life. For some, it even appeared practical. China, after all, is a global power with millions of citizens traveling, working, and studying abroad. Its current embassy in Portland Place was overcrowded, outdated, and far too small for the scale of operations that Beijing now demanded. So when plans emerged to redevelop the Royal Mint site into a vast new Chinese embassy complex, it was presented as both logical and necessary. But London is no ordinary city, and the Royal Mint is no ordinary site. The history of the place runs deep, woven into the fabric of Britain's identity. For over 2 centuries, coins were struck here, symbols of power, trade, and empire. The walls of the Mint had witnessed monarchs rise and fall, wars fought and won, and the steady rhythm of an island nation expanding its influence across the globe. To many Londoners, this was not just a piece of land. It was a memory, a monument, and a mark of national pride. When whispers spread that this historic ground might soon become home to a massive Chinese embassy, the largest in Europe, unease began to ripple through political circles and the public. What would it mean, people asked, for a rival superpower to plant its flag so close to Britain's most sensitive institutions? What secrets might be hidden behind those looming embassy walls? From the very beginning, this embassy was different. It was not just another consular office. According to the plans, it would include sprawling administrative blocks, cultural halls, underground levels, and reinforced structures. Its scale was unprecedented, its ambition unmistakable. For Beijing, this was more than bricks and mortar. It was a declaration, a statement to the world that China's presence in Europe was permanent, powerful, and undeniable. But for Britain, the picture looked more complicated. The Royal Mint site sits in Tower Hamlets, a densely populated borough that already struggles with housing shortages, traffic congestion, and overburdened public services. Locals worried that the arrival of such a vast diplomatic compound would transform their daily lives. Streets once quiet could turn into protest grounds. Police checkpoints and security lockdowns could become routine. For a community already stretched thin, the embassy felt less like progress and more like an intrusion. Then came the whispers from behind closed doors. The concerns of Britain's intelligence community. To the public, embassies are symbols of diplomacy, bridges between nations, but to intelligence experts, they are also something else. Potential hubs of espionage. History has shown this time and again. During the Cold War, embassies were riddled with hidden microphones, secret tunnels, and encrypted communication rooms. They were not just places of negotiation, but centers of surveillance. In the modern age, the tools have changed, but the game remains the same. Cyber warfare, hacking, data interception, and advanced surveillance are now weapons of choice. And here was China, a nation already accused of cyber intrusions and intelligence gathering, asking to build its largest embassy just steps away from sensitive government offices, financial centers, and key transport hubs. It was this combination, the historic site, the strategic location, and the global rivalry that turned the Royal Mint project into a firestorm. From Downing Street to Tower Hamlets town halls, debates grew fierce. Should Britain allow China to cement its presence in the very heart of its capital? Or should it stand firm, risking diplomatic fallout but safeguarding its national security? The media quickly caught on. Headlines screamed of spies, secrets, and surveillance. Reporters dug into the embassy's design, highlighting its underground structures and secure communication facilities. Though common in many diplomatic compounds, here they fed a growing suspicion. What exactly would China be doing inside those fortified walls? Meanwhile, residents of Tower Hamlets organized meetings and demonstrations. For them, the issue was not just geopolitics, but daily survival. They demanded affordable housing, community spaces, and investments in local infrastructure, not an embassy that could bring protests, lockdowns, and endless security checks. Some argued that the Royal Mint should be preserved as a cultural site, a reminder of Britain's heritage rather than a canvas for another nation's ambitions. And so, the Royal Mint mystery began to take shape. What seemed at first like a routine redevelopment project was fast becoming a battleground for issues much larger than London alone. It was about the balance between history and modernity, between diplomacy and espionage, between community needs and global politics. The whispers of intelligence briefings, the protests of residents, and the caution of politicians all collided in a storm that would only grow more intense. Britain was about to face one of the most complicated diplomatic dilemmas in its recent history. And all of it centered on one patch of land, a place where coins once carried the face of kings, and where now the future of British sovereignty was being tested. In those early days, the story carried an almost cinematic quality, a superpower seeking to mark its territory, a nation struggling with its place in a changing world, a community caught between heritage and upheaval, and in the middle, a site whose walls had once echoed with the sound of minting coins, now echoing with the whispers of espionage and distrust. But this was only the beginning. The debates in Parliament were yet to ignite. The pressure from Washington was yet to be felt. The diplomatic clashes with Beijing were yet to unfold. Part 1 of the Royal Mint mystery was about setting the stage, a stage where history, power, and politics would collide in ways few could have predicted. What would follow would test not just London but the very soul of Britain's foreign policy. And as the controversy deepened, it became clear that the Royal Mint was no longer simply a piece of land. It was a symbol of rivalry, of resistance, and of the quiet but fierce battle that was about to engulf the heart of London. As the embassy plan moved from whispers to official proposals, the mood in Britain began to shift. What had started as murmurs of concern grew into a chorus of alarm, echoing through the corridors of power. The Royal Mint site, once a proud monument of British history, was now at the heart of a storm about espionage, national security, and the fragile balance of diplomacy behind the walls of Whitehall. Intelligence chiefs prepared reports that painted a troubling picture. They warned that the proposed Chinese embassy was not just a matter of architecture or diplomacy but of surveillance and control. Its location, in Tower Hamlets, was dangerously close to sensitive sites, government ministries, financial districts, and even transport hubs that kept the city alive. To intelligence officers, this was not coincidence, it was strategy. For decades, Britain had lived in the shadow of espionage. From Soviet spies during the Cold War to digital hackers in the modern age, the nation knew the value of vigilance. And yet, here was an opportunity for a rival power to build a fortress right in the heart of London. British spies imagined the possibilities: antennas hidden in rooftops, underground cables feeding into secret data centers, encrypted transmissions bouncing invisibly across the city. In an age where cyber warfare mattered as much as tanks or missiles, the Royal Mint Embassy looked less like a diplomatic hub and more like a weapon. But intelligence warnings, however urgent, rarely stay confined to classified reports. Leaks began to trickle into the press. Newspapers published stories about secret cables and covert fears. Headlines declared that Britain was sleepwalking into an espionage disaster. The public began to see the embassy not as a place of cultural exchange but as a Trojan horse, designed to watch, listen, and influence. In Parliament, the debate heated up. Members of Parliament demanded answers from ministers. Could Britain impose conditions on the embassy's construction? Could it guarantee that the site would not be used for spying? Or was this an impossible task, given the protections international law affords embassies? Some MPs thundered against the project, insisting that it was madness to allow a rival state such proximity to Britain's core institutions. Others urged caution, warning that rejecting the embassy could spark a diplomatic crisis with Beijing, with consequences that stretched far beyond London. For while the Royal Mint was a local issue, the implications were global. The relationship between the UK and China was already under strain. Disputes over Hong Kong, accusations of human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and the banning of Huawei from Britain's 5G network had cast a long shadow. Trust was thin, suspicion thick. And now, the embassy proposal poured fuel onto the fire. Outside of Westminster, the voices of ordinary people added to the tension. In Tower Hamlets, community meetings turned emotional. Residents worried about more than espionage. They worried about their lives being disrupted. Their streets turned into battlegrounds between protesters and police. Some imagined daily barricades, security checks that would make the borough feel less like a community and more like a fortress. Others pointed out that the land could serve a different purpose: affordable housing, schools, or public spaces. Why, they asked, should one of London's most historic sites be handed over to a foreign power? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Washington was watching closely. To the United States, Britain was not just an ally but a critical partner in intelligence sharing through the Five Eyes network. Any security lapse in London was a risk for Washington too. American officials, already locked in a strategic rivalry with Beijing, quietly urged Britain to think carefully. They warned of the dangers of letting China plant its flag so close to the heart of power. And though these warnings were rarely spoken aloud, their influence could be felt. Britain was being pulled into the wider game of superpowers, a game it could not escape. Back in London, the divisions within government grew sharper. Some ministers argued that rejecting the embassy outright could provoke Beijing into retaliation. They feared for British businesses in China, for students studying abroad, for delicate trade relations that kept the economy afloat. Others, however, insisted that the risks were too great to ignore. Security had to come first. Sovereignty was not negotiable. That it was in this tense climate that the Royal Mint site transformed from a piece of land into a battlefield of ideas. The press called it a diplomatic flashpoint. Intelligence chiefs called it a security nightmare. Community leaders called it a betrayal of local needs. And in Beijing, officials dismissed the entire controversy as paranoia, accusing Britain of fueling anti-China sentiment for political gain. Chinese diplomats insisted that the embassy was nothing more than a practical necessity. Their current premises, they said, were outdated and overcrowded. The new complex would handle visas, consular services, and cultural events. To accuse it of espionage, they argued, was insulting and unfounded, but the more they protested, the deeper the suspicion seemed to grow. Journalists added fuel to the fire. Investigations revealed that the embassy's design included multiple underground levels, secure communications facilities, and reinforced structures. While such features were not unusual for diplomatic compounds, they looked sinister to a public already primed for suspicion. Was this really about consular services, or was it about something far darker? And so, the mystery deepened. The Royal Mint project was no longer a simple redevelopment. It had become a symbol of mistrust, of rivalry, of the uneasy dance between nations in an age of uncertainty. By late summer, the controversy had reached fever pitch. Local councils debated the application. National newspapers ran exposes. Protesters gathered outside government buildings. Intelligence assessments piled up on ministers' desks. Every day seemed to bring a new revelation, a new warning, a new reason to doubt. For Britain, the question grew harder. Could it afford to alienate Beijing, risking economic retaliation and diplomatic fallout? Or could it afford to welcome China into the heart of London, risking espionage and surveillance? Either way, the stakes were enormous, and for the people of Tower Hamlets, caught in the middle, the embassy was not an abstract question of geopolitics but a daily reality. It was about whether their streets would remain their own, or whether they would be transformed into a stage for a global drama. By now, the Royal Mint mystery had become more than a local planning dispute. It was a test of Britain's resolve, its identity, and its place in a world where power was shifting and trust was scarce. The next moves would not only decide the fate of one building but also reveal how far Britain was willing to go to protect its sovereignty. And as Parliament prepared for heated debates, as Washington whispered in Britain's ear, and as Beijing watched with growing frustration, one thing was clear: the Royal Mint was no longer just about history. It was about the future. The storm that had been gathering around the Royal Mint finally broke into the open. What began as quiet debates in Westminster and classified warnings from intelligence services spilled onto the streets of London, and nowhere was the tension more visible than in Tower Hamlets itself. The community that once carried the history of the Royal Mint now carried the weight of the embassy controversy. Meetings in local halls grew louder, more crowded, and more emotional. Parents worried about their children walking past barricaded streets. Shop owners feared the constant presence of police and security checks, driving customers away. For some, it was no longer about politics or international rivalries. It was about survival, about protecting the fragile rhythm of their daily lives. Soon, the anger spilled onto the streets. Protesters marched through Tower Hamlets, carrying signs that "Read homes, not embassies, and stop the spies." Their voices echoed across the historic streets, a chorus of frustration against what they saw as an intrusion into their lives. For many, the Royal Mint site represented an opportunity for community renewal, housing for families, schools for children, spaces for the people, but instead they were being asked to accept a fortress of another nation, one that came with risks and suspicions. The protests grew larger with each passing week. Families stood shoulder to shoulder with activists, students joined hands with local leaders, and chants filled the air. Soon the demonstrations attracted national attention. Television crews broadcast the images, rows of police officers, crowds, holding banners, the shadow of the old Royal Mint looming in the background. What had once been a local dispute was now a national spectacle, and with the cameras came politics. Opposition politicians seized on the controversy, accusing the government of weakness, of failing to stand up to Beijing. They called the embassy plan reckless, a threat to Britain's sovereignty. Ministers, already under pressure from intelligence chiefs, now faced the added weight of public anger. The Prime Minister's office tried to strike a careful tone, insisting that the government was reviewing the matter in line with national security. But behind closed doors, the pressure was immense. As if that were not enough, Washington's whispers grew louder. American officials, deeply suspicious of China's global ambitions, reminded London of the risks. They warned that a giant Chinese embassy in the heart of London could compromise not just Britain's security but the security of allies as well. Britain, after all, was a key partner in the Five Eyes intelligence network, alongside the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. If Britain allowed Beijing such proximity to its core institutions, could it still be trusted with the secrets of allies? The implication was clear, even if rarely spoken aloud. For Britain, this was no small matter. Its special relationship with Washington was one of its most valuable assets, both strategically and politically. To alienate the United States would be costly, and yet, to provoke Beijing by rejecting the embassy outright could also bring consequences. Chinese officials had already expressed frustration. dismissing the controversy as paranoia and warning that Britain risked damaging relations. Businesses feared retaliation, universities feared losing Chinese students, diplomats feared an escalation that could spiral beyond control. The government was trapped between two superpowers, each pulling in different directions, while its own citizens protested in the streets. It was a balancing act of the highest order, and the stakes could not have been higher. Inside Westminster, debates reached a fever pitch. Some ministers insisted that Britain had no choice but to reject the embassy, arguing that sovereignty and security were not negotiable. Others countered that Britain could not afford to pick a fight with Beijing, not at a time when the economy was already under strain. Every option seemed to carry risk. To say yes was to invite suspicion and potential espionage. To say no was to invite retaliation and economic pain. The protests outside Parliament grew as well. Demonstrators from Tower Hamlets traveled to Westminster, their chants echoing outside the gates. "Protect London, protect Britain," they shouted, their voices carried by cameras and microphones. The images spread across the nation, fueling public anger. For many Britons watching at home, the embassy was no longer just about Tower Hamlets. It was about Britain's identity, its sovereignty, and its ability to stand up to powerful rivals. Meanwhile, the press uncovered more stories that deepened the mystery. Reports suggested that the embassy's design included multiple underground levels and advanced communication facilities. Experts speculated about their purpose, warning that they could be used for cyber intrusion or surveillance. Though such features were not unusual for embassies, the context made them sinister. Every revelation, every detail seemed to confirm the fears of espionage. The tension reached a point where the Royal Mint site no longer felt like a piece of land. It felt like a battlefield, one where history, community, and global politics collided. For residents of Tower Hamlets, the protests were about protecting their homes. For Parliament, it was about protecting national security. For Washington, it was about maintaining trust. And for Beijing, it was about respect and recognition. Caught in the middle, Britain struggled to find a path forward. The Prime Minister's advisors weighed options late into the night. Could the embassy be approved with strict conditions? Could it be relocated to a less sensitive area? Could Britain find a compromise that would satisfy both Beijing and Washington, while calming its own citizens? None of the answers seemed easy, and so the Royal Mint mystery deepened even further. The protests in Tower Hamlets continued to swell, becoming larger, louder, and harder to ignore. The pressure from Washington intensified, each conversation carrying the weight of an unspoken threat. The frustration from Beijing hardened, with officials framing Britain's hesitation as a sign of hostility. The clock was ticking, and a decision could not be delayed much longer. What had begun as whispers of unease had grown into a crisis. The Royal Mint was no longer a relic of Britain's past. It was now the stage for one of the most dramatic diplomatic confrontations of modern times. The voices of protesters, the warnings of spies, the whispers of allies, and the demands of rivals all converged in one place. And as Britain inched closer to a decision, the whole world watched. The next chapter of this story would decide more than just the fate of one embassy. It would decide how Britain saw itself in a world where power was shifting, where trust was rare, and where even a patch of land could ignite a global storm. The tension surrounding the Royal Mint site had reached its breaking point. For months the debate had consumed Parliament, rattled communities, and strained diplomatic ties. But the time for hesitation had ended. The Prime Minister, after weeks of intense pressure, knew that a decision had to be made. Britain could no longer live in the shadow of uncertainty. The final discussions inside Downing Street were marked by urgency. Intelligence chiefs delivered their last warnings, pointing to the risks of espionage and surveillance. Economic advisors spoke of the dangers of retaliation, reminding ministers of China's role in trade, investment, and global markets. Diplomats pleaded for caution, while political strategists calculated the impact on voters, allies, and Britain's image on the world stage. It was not a simple choice of yes or no. It was a choice between two futures. And yet, when the moment came, the decision was stark and clear. Britain rejected China's plan to build its vast new embassy on the Royal Mint site. The announcement was delivered in careful words, dressed in the language of planning, regulations, and community concerns. Officials explained that the embassy proposal did not meet security requirements, that its size and design posed risks to the surrounding community. They spoke of heritage protections, urban planning, and the need for balance. But everyone knew the truth behind the careful words. Britain had chosen security over diplomacy, sovereignty over compromise. The reaction was immediate. In Tower Hamlets, the news was greeted with cheers. Protesters who had marched for months finally felt heard. Their banners, once waved in frustration, now became symbols of victory. Families who had feared the shadow of a fortress embassy now breathed a sigh of relief. For them, this was not just a political decision. It was a triumph of ordinary voices over global powers across the nation. The announcement sparked fierce debates and praised the government for standing firm, for refusing to bend to Beijing. Others warned of the consequences of the storm Britain might have unleashed. For every cheer, there was a shiver of uncertainty. Beijing's response came swiftly. Officials condemned the decision as unjust and discriminatory. State media framed it as evidence of Western paranoia, portraying Britain as a pawn of Washington. Chinese diplomats accused London of undermining trust, warning of consequences for trade and cooperation. Though the words were measured, the undertone was unmistakable. Beijing was furious. Behind the scenes, Chinese officials began reviewing investment deals, trade agreements, and cultural exchanges. Universities worried about losing Chinese students. Businesses feared tariffs, and exporters braced for retaliation. The chill in relations was immediate, and the shadow of uncertainty spread. In Washington, however, the reaction was different. American officials quietly welcomed Britain's stance, seeing it as a sign of alignment in the global struggle against Beijing. Though the United States never publicly claimed credit, whispers spread that Washington had played a decisive role. Behind closed doors, Britain's decision was not just about London. It was about the balance of power across the world. For Britain, the choice came at a cost, but also with a message. By rejecting the embassy, London had signaled that sovereignty was not for sale, that security could not be compromised. The Royal Mint site, once a relic of history, had become a symbol of resistance, of a small nation's determination to stand its ground against giants. And yet, the story did not end there. The site itself remained empty, its future uncertain. Some called for housing projects, others for museums or cultural centers. But whatever its fate, the Royal Mint would forever carry the memory of this confrontation. It was no longer just a place where coins were struck. It was a place where history had turned, where Britain had faced a choice and chosen a path. As the years passed, the decision continued to shape Britain's identity. Relations with Beijing cooled, economic ties weakened, but Britain found new strength in alliances with other nations equally wary of China's ambitions. The controversy reminded the world that even in an age of superpowers, smaller nations still had a voice, still had the power to say no. In Tower Hamlets, life slowly returned to normal. The protests faded, the police withdrew, and the streets once again carried the quiet hum of daily life. Yet for the people who had marched, the memory lingered. They had stood against something far larger than themselves, and in the end, they had prevailed. For Britain, the Royal Mint mystery became more than a chapter in its diplomatic history. It became a parable, a lesson for future generations about vigilance, sovereignty, and the costs of decisions made under the weight of giants. It proved that history is not only written in battlefields or parliaments, but also in the streets of ordinary neighborhoods where voices rise, where people refuse to be silent. And so, the story of China's embassy in London did not end with bricks and mortar, with a building rising or falling. It ended with something far more powerful, a message carved into the fabric of history. A message that Britain, though tested, chose to stand its ground. The Royal Mint still stands, its stones bearing witness to centuries of change, but now, it carries a new legacy, not of coins, not of wealth, but of sovereignty, defiance, and the unyielding belief that even in the shadows of superpowers, the voice of a nation still matters. The mystery may never fully fade. Questions will linger about what could have been, about what was lost, and about what the future may hold. But one truth is certain. The Royal Mint, once a place of currency, became a currency of its own, a currency of power, pride, and the eternal struggle for control in a changing world.